Welcome, I'm Debbie Urban with Stock Development, and we are proud to sponsor this session on protecting your license with Darla First and Thomas Luzier. Darla First has been a Florida real estate broker for 43 years. She has had experience as a real estate broker, a marketing director for a large law firm, sales manager, and business owner. She is an active member of the Realtor Association of Sarasota and Manatee, having served as 2003 president of the association and chairing numerous committees. Darla received the SAR Meritorious Service Award in 1998, was the SAR Realtor of the Year for 2006, and received Raisin's Distinguished Service Award in 2016 and is a Realtor Emeritus. On the state level, in addition to being on the board of directors for Florida Realtors and serving on numerous state committees, she was a district vice president in 2006 and has held positions on Florida Realtors Executive Committee. In 2010, Governor Charlie Crist appointed Darla to the Florida Real Estate Commission, and she was reappointed for a second term by Governor Scott in 2012. Darla served as a chair for FREC in 2012 and again 2015. In the spring of 2012, Darla was invited to the White House to meet with the Department of Housing and the Department of Finance regarding the Florida real estate market and distressed properties. Through the years, as a manager for Coldwell Banker and Michael Saunders and Company, Darla's passion has been real estate management, coaching associates, and delivering the dream of home ownership in beautiful Sarasota. Tom Luzier is a board-certified specialist in real estate and an attorney with Williams Parker. Tom's practice covers a wide variety of transactional matters, representing individuals and businesses in all phases of buying, financing, selling, and leasing residential and commercial property. He has successfully closed more than $1 billion in transactions to date. In 2015, Tom was appointed by Governor Rick Scott as one of two consumer members of the Florida Real Estate Commission, which administers and enforces Florida's real estate license law. Tom served as the 2018 chair of the FREC. A native Sarasotan, Tom's civic affiliations include causes that promote the diversification of Florida's economy and preservation of its cultural heritage. Tom is past chair of the Board of Trustees of the Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, which he also chaired its CEO search, audit, and nominating committees. He is a past member of the Board of the Directors of John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art Foundation. Tom's comments on Sarasota's history, economy, and real estate market have appeared in publications such as the New York Times, Gulf Coast Business Review, the Sarasota Herald Tribune, SRQ, New York Social Diary, and Metropolis. Please welcome Darla and Tom.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you are enjoying your day. This is, as you know, a new effort on the behalf of Raisin, and we're all very excited about it. I think the goal that Tom and I have for this session today is, number one, not to bore you, and number two, to just kind of enlighten you about a lot of the background and the processes at FREC that you might not be aware of. And maybe hopefully to make you start thinking that FREC isn't a bad thing, that it's a good thing, because we do a lot of good for the world of real estate in the state of Florida. So I'm going to start off with how we got there, because oftentimes I'm asked, how did you ever get to be on FREC? I can tell you it certainly wasn't on my bucket list. When I got my real estate license and when I started different management positions with different companies, I never, ever had at the top of my goals to serve on FREC. But it came about and it's kind of a testimony to your involvement in the Realtor Association, both on the local and the state level. I had been involved in quite a few committees with the Florida Realtors. And in October of 2009, I was sitting in the office and I get this random call from Cynthia Shelton, who was the president of the Florida Realtor Association at that time. And she said, Darla, she said, there is an opening on FREC. There's a seat opened at FREC. And she said, we would like, the Florida Realtors would like to put your name in application for that seat. And I just sat there thinking, why would I do that? And I think a lot of it because of the mindset that I had at the time of what FREC really did. But I started thinking about it, started looking into it, and with the support of my husband and Michael Saunders, the company that I worked for, I went forward with it. And I was appointed, as was said, by Governor Christ, and I started my tenure in April of 2010. I often tell people when they ask me what was it like being on FREC for quite a number of years, I was the only female on FREC for the first 4 years that I was on, first 3 years that I was on. And so when people would ask me, well, tell me what it's really like, I would say, well, it's a little bit like the Jerry Springer show, and I'm Judge Judy, and that's really the truth. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom and let Tom tell you how he got to FREC.
Well, my matriculation to FREC was a testament to your salesmanship. You lured me to a lovely lunch on the promise of an interesting opportunity. Of course, I thought that was perhaps the opportunity to meet some new agents who might refer me some business. You assured me that joining FREC would enrich my practice. It would inform how I viewed the real estate profession. I'd meet wonderful people from all over the state. And by the way, there's a little bit of work involved, but I could bang it out in a weekend before the meetings, which occur every month in Orlando that you have to pack up and drive to and stay over for. And so I thought, well, why would I do that? Just like you did, but you convinced me. And then I got my first packet of preparation materials and realized that they give you 10 plus days to assimilate all that information because it's thousands of pages of information. And you literally are working from the time you get it to the time you show up in Orlando in order to do your job well. And so that part I think was a little undersold, but it was everything that you said it was, which was, it really informed my outlook on the agent experience and the industry. And I met some wonderful people, and my term was over and I did not re-up. I just had a lot of work to do here. So thank you, Darla.
And Tom, I think one thing that Tom's too modest to mention, it was mentioned to you in the entry that he was chair of FREC. And what was unusual about that is there are 2 consumer members out of the 7 that are appointed to FREC. And Tom was the first consumer member, meaning he wasn't a licensee in real estate in many, many, many years. And I think that is a testimony to how the peers, because the chairmanship is voted on by the rest of the FREC committee, I think that's a testimony to how the peers felt about Tom being on the committee and what he brought to the table. So it was a good ride. Thank you, Tom.
It was.
All right. So let's go, and I'm having trouble forwarding. There we go. Let's talk about, to begin with, the growing numbers in FREC. And I went back to some of my contacts at DBPR and asked for some statistics. And the most recent ones that they could give me that weren't posted yet was August, but that will kind of enlighten you as to what's going on. So in the month of August alone, in the state of Florida, there were 5,847 exams given. Out of those, 3,209 were first-time takers, and they passed. The rate of passing in that August exam was 53%. Here's what's interesting. There were 2,638 repeat takers that were taking it again and maybe even multiple times. Look at where the pass rate drops to 33%.
And that is consistent month over month, year over year, in terms of the testing numbers. The more you take it, the less likely it's gonna hit.
It's so true.
Yep.
And then for brokers in the month of August, there were 407 brokers tested. Out of those, 239 were first-time takers with a rate of passing of 57%, and 168 repeat takers, and again with a rate of 36%. So it doesn't get any easier. And then license counts. Here's what's kind of interesting. Total license counts under the Florida Real Estate Commission in the state of Florida are 431,088. Now, before you gasp with that, I want you to understand that that includes things like the appraisers, it includes things like the instructors. If there are multiple branch offices connected to a brokerage, each one of those would be a separate count. So that's the total licensees to FREC. With regard to current sales associates, there's 209,638 active licensees in the state of Florida. Broker sales associates, 21,820. And then current brokers with active offices, 41,813. I think what's interesting about this is that gives you a total of 273,271 of sales associates, broker sales associates, and brokers. But what I think is important to plug into that figure, the count of Florida realtors, people that are licensed in the state of Florida as real estate licensees, but hold membership with the Florida Realtor Association, there's only, I shouldn't say only, but there's 195,000 that are realtors. So you're talking about in excess of 78,000 real estate licensees that are not realtor members. And so when you come across someone that is not a realtor member, I think it's just enlightening to remember that they don't have to abide by the code of ethics. They don't stand to be charged through grievance boards from the local Realtor Association because they're not realtor members. I know that the Florida Realtor Association is constantly working on how to get a higher number of those non-realtor members into the realtor family so that we can improve how we operate in the state of Florida.
I remember early on in my FREC career using the term realtor loosely rather than referring to a licensee as such or as an agent. And a gentleman got up at the end during public comment and summarily reprimanded me for basically advocating on behalf of Florida realtors by using that term. And so I never made the mistake again. But what I think is particularly interesting about the overall number, when I turned off in 2018, we were bumping up a little over the 400 number, and that was even accounting for the attrition that would happen annually around renewal time.
Right.
And so you look at this, and in a couple of years now, we've added about 15,000 per year, but that's actually more given that there's attrition every year when the renewal happens. So those are pretty incredible numbers.
Yeah. And then with regard to real estate brokerages or corporations, there are 28,959. So I'm going to kind of turn this over right now to Tom. We thought it would be interesting to kind of lead you through the process of filing a complaint to FREC, because oftentimes we get questioned, I did during my tenure, well, I just filed a complaint 4 months ago and I still haven't heard anything. So Tom's going to walk us through that process.
Sure, and I think it bears a little bit of discussion up front to talk about the difference between what you complain to FREC about versus what you complain to your local board about, what constitutes an MLS violation. I think talking about using terms loosely, people will say, oh, I'm just that I have a commission dispute, I'm going to file a complaint with FREC. Well, that's not where you file that complaint. That goes to your local board. Or that agent did an end run around me and went direct to my client. I'm going to file a complaint with FREC. Well, that's not a FREC-worthy complaint. That's something that you go to your local board about. Just like I always tell agents that the contract form is their stock and trade. Well, Chapter 475 of Florida statutes is your Bible, because that tells you who needs a license, what the qualifications are for your practice, and the basis for discipline. should do not behave. And something that is complainable to FREC, that's if you feel like your fellow agent is guilty of fraud or misrepresentation, false promises, they violated some duty, they've misappropriated funds, they've been found guilty of, or they've pled to a crime that calls into question their moral character and involves the practice of real estate. It's things like that you complain to FREC about. It's easy to make that complaint. You can do it anonymously, actually. But once you make the complaint, it sets into motion this process that can take many months to wind its way through, and involves lots of people from beginning to end. Once you make the complaint, an investigator is assigned by the Division of Real Estate, and they're the ones they're talking to the people that are involved, they're collecting documents, they're basically writing up their report, their investigative report, that's then submitted to an attorney who then analyzes the case to decide if there's anything worthy of prosecution or not, or somewhere in between. And so that recommendation, that package actually of the investigative report, the attorney's analysis and recommendations, then goes to FREC's grand jury, which is called the probable cause panel. That, of course, is a revolving seat of a current commission member and a past commission member that meets once a month. And they go through the various cases that are ripe at that point, and they make a decision whether there's an offense that needs prosecution and goes on to FREC for that, or if there's no there, they also make that determination. Sometimes they look and they say, well, there's nothing we can necessarily prosecute here, but there's possibly some not so good behavior. And so we're going to send a letter of guidance to this agent and say, do better next time. In the event that it goes forward to FREC, well, that's a quasi-judicial hearing. And FREC is, that panel of commissioners is the judge and jury. As you remember, Darla, people would show up for their appearance in Orlando, and you'd be there in front of this row of people you'd never met, with staff people to your right and left, and a room full of people you'd never met behind you. You stand up with your attorney. Now it all, of course, happens by Zoom. The attorney for the division presents their case. Then you have the opportunity to present your case. The commission then hears testimony, asks you questions, etc., and then they deliberate. And discipline can run the gamut. Now, between the statute and the Florida Administrative Code, there's a range of discipline that's available depending on what the offense is. Generally, you're assessed your fees and your costs associated with the case. There can be financial penalties, education requirements. You can be required to go to FREC and spend a few hours there. Your license can be suspended or it can be revoked. So it all depends on what it is that you are charged with and whether you're determined to be guilty of. If you don't like the outcome, you go to the Division of Administrative Hearings in Tallahassee, and it winds its way back to FREC eventually. But it's a long process, involves a lot of people. It's a very serious process. Be careful. So I don't enter into it lightly.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very concise, quick way of getting through this, but I hope that gives you some understanding of the time that it takes. We used to have licensees here from the Sarasota Manatee area that it would be on front page of the newspaper, something that they had done while I was on the commission. Yeah. And I would get emails and calls saying, how can you let this guy, or gal continue to operate? And this is the process. Now, I will tell you the one thing that I didn't put on here, and I was thinking about this later, there is what's called an ESO, an emergency suspension order. Mm-hmm. And if it was deemed that this person really should not be practicing because they were a detriment to the consumer financially or any other means, a an ESO could be filed. The problem with that is that the secretary of DBPR is the only one that can enact an ESO. So FREC could recommend that an ESO be served, which would take that person out of the business until they were able to come in front of FREC. My tenure on the commission, I think that we only had about 4 ESOs the entire time I was on there. So unfortunately, they're not frequent.
I heard rumors about ESOs. That was like the unicorn one during my term. I never saw one.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's talk about what are some of the hot FREC violations? What are some of the things that we saw a lot of during our stay at FREC? And Tom, I think you're going to address property management violations.
Property management is it's peculiar in terms of the regulation, and there's kind of bits and pieces of what property management or how the licensure law impacts property management. But the main piece to keep in mind is that if you are dealing with money, you have got to be a broker. And where we would see, and you'll recall this, where we would see the issues with property management, folks would be approaching it in kind of a casual way. They had a great closing. Their buyers live out of state. They ask them to do some things with the house, perhaps assist with procuring the tenants, overseeing renovations, etc. Typically either not documented or ill-documented. And then if you added money into the mix, they would say, oh, just collect the rent for us and reimburse us. That's where the wheels all tend to fall off. And so my advice is always with property management is try and leave it to the professionals. They get a fee for a reason. They keep the appropriate licensure. I mean, if you want to venture down that road, make sure you have clearly outlined in the way of an agreement what you're agreeing to do, because it is fraught with danger.
Yeah, and I would, from a manager standpoint, I would even suggest that you don't go anywhere near that unless you have a conversation with your broker and manager as to what that customer is asking you to do and what can you do. I know that something as simple as, and I remember this one case that came in front of us, something as simple as the agent had sold the property, a condo, to an out-of-town owner, as Tom walked through, and the refrigerator went out. And the owner said, well, just go to Sears and buy me a new refrigerator and I'll reimburse you. So the agent did. And there's nothing really illegal about that action. But then what happened was the owner also asked the agent during the course of the next 6 or 9 months to do similar things, like a new dishwasher or have the rugs cleaned or whatever. And he would always send him the receipt, he'd pay for it, the agent would pay for it, and the owner would reimburse the agent. Then all of a sudden, the relationship turned sour. And the owner was savvy enough to know that that could be a stumbling block for the agent. And so he filed a complaint with FREC and said that the agent had been taking unsolicited commission funds from him. And the agent had not kept track of those receipts. As it turned out, he was able to come to us in front of us and rectify what had happened. But it's just kind of a good lesson that we learned through that one.
Well, you remembered what those files would look like. Oftentimes you would have these pages and pages of screenshots of text messages back and forth. You would have handwritten documents. You'd have pictures of busted plumbing. I mean, it was such a conglomeration of stuff, and to make heads or tails of it, and then to add insult to injury, you have the individual having to come in and defend themselves.
Right.
It just reinforced time and time again. You just leave it alone unless there's some incredible reason not to.
Exactly.
Hey guys, sorry to bomb your session really quick. Tom, I know you're a little bit farther away from Darla's mic. If you could just speak up a little bit better.
Sure, will do.
A little bit more. Thank you.
Okay, so this next one, I have a legacy at FREC for. I was known as kind kind of the guillotine for mortgage fraud cases, if you will.
You were.
You know, we know, for those of you who have come into this business recently and not familiar with it, you can certainly Google it and get lots of good reading material. But basically what it was licensees that were working with lenders and attorneys and all kinds of related businesses that were literally, because the appreciation was so rampant in 2006 and 7 and 5, that we were seeing a lot of cases where, and this is just one kind of quick example of where a seller would sell to a buyer, and the realtor then would fraudulently work with a loan officer to sell almost simultaneously that property again, inflating the appraisal. There would be an appraiser that was on the hook with them, and sometimes as much as 50% again of the price that it just sold for in that morning, get the funding and then take off with the money. And it was such a racket. And I did become very, very passionate about that happening, because it absolutely ruined the lives of so many people, not just real estate people, all kinds of related businesses that were predominant on real estate. And then we plummeted with the recession, and it was a nightmare. So what would happen is at FREC, we would have, I think one of my favorite ones, and I'm not picking on the lenders out in the world of the marketplace, but the lenders would have literally served jail time for mortgage fraud, for doing these kinds of inflated sales. And then they would get out. Literally, I'll never forget, we had a guy come in front of us that unfortunately was from our own marketplace. And he wanted to get a real estate license. Now, mind you, he was a convict. He had been convicted of a felony. He had served time. He had changed documents. He just all kinds of fraud. And then he wanted to come in front of us and get a real estate license. And as you can see me kind of flushing right now, thinking about it, I mean, I would literally go off. And I had a pat speech that everybody would just go. I mean, half the times the commissioners, of course, we'd read the case, but we would just go, the commissioners would go, okay, Darla, do you want to give us your thoughts on that? And I would just say, give me some reason that we should hire you, but this is what you did, or we should license you, but this is what you did.
That's
Tom?
absolutely the truth. We would just defer to you whenever it was time for us to deliberate. We just look down the table and say, okay, your turn.
And I'm not going to name names or anything like that, but for those of you who, just to give you an idea, there was a local case here of I'm sorry, the only thing I can call it is a racket that involved a real estate licensee, a couple of them, an appraisal firm, a title company, and of course a lender. And there were 22 people that were indicted because of this one ring here in town. It was one of the largest mortgage fraud schemes in the state, to the tune of over $200 million. So you can understand why, I was the queen of mortgage fraud cases, so to speak. The next violation is maintaining an active license status and the required education of CE. Now, Tom, jump in there if you have anything to say about this, but basically what we're talking about here is, that you have to renew your license every 2 years. You know that if you're newly licensed, you have to take the post-licensing course. These are things that you were tested on when you got your license. There's 2 renewal periods, the end of March and the end of September. You have to take your CE course to renew. And yet, what would happen is somebody would either forget to pay the state. They would go in, they'd take their course, and they'd go in and renew their application, but they'd forget to submit the payment. And then let's say their license expired March 31st, all of a sudden they're doing their business thinking everything was fine. And then they come across maybe a competitor who just happened to go online and check to see the status of his license and discovered that he was inactive. Now, in the eyes of FREC, that guy was really, even though it was innocent, he was guilty of unlicensed activity because he was practicing real estate actively with an inactive license. So, it's a big concern and not one to take lightly. What I always suggest to agents that they do, and particularly to brokers and office managers, I know this sounds crazy, but at the end of every renewal period, I would go in and check with DBPR, everyone that you have on your roster, and make sure that DBPR has them stated as actively licensed. And for you as an agent, I would just do it myself. We did have cases, and I will admit, nobody's perfect. And there were cases where DBPR dropped the ball. They didn't have it, they lost their CE requirement. So, again, my caution is to please go online and check, your status after every renewal period.
Well, and the license is not that easy to get, right? And so you want to protect it. And these are the kind of technical infractions that can cause you heartache and headaches down the road. And even if you're being cavalier and you're not paying attention, others are. And so you will get reported by the competition because they're out there, they're looking at that. One of my favorite requests that we received was from someone who waited until the very last moment they could possibly get their continuing education done, yet they happened to be on Pacific time when they completed their education. So they got it done by, I believe, midnight out west, but it was 3 a.m. in the east. And so technically they didn't timely complete their requirements. So then they had to come to Orlando and ask for a special exception, which I don't know that they got. I don't honestly recall, but it's that kind of thing. That's unnecessary. And it's fairly easy to keep track of that. And so you should.
And to the brokers and office managers that are listening in, just a caution too, if you are paying a referral fee to a licensee that's not licensed with your firm, I would caution you also to go online and check and make sure that the licensee that you're paying that referral fee to is licensed. We had cases of that, where somebody purported to having an active license and didn't.
Right. And you can get disciplined for that. You're not allowed to share a commission with someone who's unlicensed.
So, and again, these violations at face value, when you see them here on the PowerPoint presentation, you think, well, that can't be that big of a deal, but it can. And like Tom said at the very beginning, last thing you want to do is have to spend time and energy and worry about getting summoned in front of FREC to have to explain something so innocent, really. Tom's going to kind of go over a similar kind of violation that we saw a lot of, and that is in reporting criminal charges.
Well, and this is a simple one too. And when you take your courses, you're instructed, there's a self-reporting requirement if you are charged with or you plead no contest to a crime questioning your moral fitness or something relating to the practice. And so people would conveniently forget, and the kind of the typical way they got caught was by a competitor who saw their name in the paper for getting a DUI, for instance, and they would report them to FREC. And so it's one of those easy things. It's an unfortunate thing, but it's one of those easy things to avoid the problem, knowing that when that happens to you, this is another layer of reporting that you have a responsibility to discharge.
And I'll tell you another kind of scenario where this kind of catches people is, let's say you have your license and something happens, DUI or something, right, and you don't report it. And let's say then you decide you're going to get your broker's license.
Yep.
And you apply for your broker's license. And even let's say that you have the good sense to report it on your broker's license, FREC is going to go back and see if you reported it
When it happened.
when it happened. And if you didn't report it when it happened, then what happens is we have a segment in the committee meetings where we pull out licensees that are asking to go forward with their broker's license or whatever. And this will flag that party that they have to come into FREC again in front of us and explain what happened. So,
well, and the refrain you would hear over and over again at FREC, you would have folks who are applying for their broker's license, and as a broker, you are held to an even higher standard than you are as just a garden variety licensee, because you can employ people, you can hold money, and the expectation is that the rules. And you're going to abide by the rules. And so it was amazing how many times we would see folks who had forgotten or who had an excuse as to why they hadn't disclosed infractions in the past. They didn't have the easiest time of it at those meetings.
yeah, that's when I called it the Jerry Springer show. And then one other violation that I don't think you hear a lot about, but we certainly do. FREC is very sensitive to this, and this is unlicensed activity. And what this means is there's someone out there that is performing the services of real estate according to Chapter 475, but they're not licensed. And I think the real caution that we wanted to get across today when Tom and I met prior to this, trying to see what we thought would be of value to all of you, is be particularly sensitive if you have an assistant, or if you have a staff person. You might have a team that you have unlicensed people on your team, which is fine. But if you ask them to do any of the services of real estate, then you yourself are guilty, as well as they are, for unlicensed activity. And believe it or not, I think it was in 2007, I want to say something like that, the practice of unlicensed activity to DBR became a felony. So this is not taken lightly. And the way we looked at it at FREC was this was literally taking money out of your pocket to pay someone to do something when they were doing services of real estate but were unlicensed. If you allow me one quick story that I have that I think always drove it home. There was a neighborhood here in Sarasota, and a very affluent neighborhood. And there was a gentleman there, and he did this 2 or 3 times before it came in front of FREC.
Is this the neighborhood commission commando that
yes,
you talked about?
Yes.
Okay.
And so what he was doing, and the one finally downfall event was he was at a association, a homeowners get together, social gathering. He heard one of the owners in the neighborhood say that they were just talking to a realtor about listing their house. In fact, they had signed the paperwork, it just hadn't gone forward. And so he went up to them and said, look, my wife's best friend is dying to move in here. Don't hang off on listing that property, and let's see if she likes your house. Lady falls in love with the house, goes to contract without the realtor. And the gentleman, and I use that calmly, the gentleman told the seller, look, just give me $10,000 under the table. It's a lot less than what you would have paid in commission. And the seller was about to do it when the realtor that was going to get the listing asked the seller why she wasn't going forward with the listing, and she told him the scenario. So what do you think that listing realtor did? He turned the guy in to FREC for unlicensed activity. So there's that segment, but then again, I want you to be sensitive to having your assistants and your staff people do activities that are unlicensed activities.
Well, they have folks dedicated at the Division of Real Estate specifically to that subject matter. And there would be times we would get folks who were applying for a license and who had charges of unlicensed activity in their past. And the statute actually specifies what we do with that. So you just want to steer clear of that wherever you can, or if you see it happening, you want to report it.
And just so you know, what FREC would do with that is they would file with the district state's attorney's office, because again, it's a felony. All right. So then probably the absolute major violation that FREC hears lots of, and they're very, very sensitive to, is escrow deposit issues. And so Tom is going to kind of highlight what you want to be really, really sensitive to with regard to taking escrow and deposits.
Well, I mean, there's kind of a couple of different ways that escrow deposits intersect with the FREC process. There's the section dealing with escrow disbursement orders where FREC is actually making the determination of entitlement to escrow deposits that are made. But then there are the regulations that surround what you do with the money and how quickly you have to get it in and into your broker's hands, into the broker's account, and the broker's duty to account for those funds. And so, we would time and time again, and you're going to be much better at giving a story or two, I'm sure. Time and time again, we would see these infractions where folks were doing things that were just 100% contrary to what 475 says you're supposed to do with the money. And usually it was always, they would plead lack of knowledge, I didn't know and I didn't understand. Well, ostensibly you sat for the exam, you should have known. So that's my segue to you maybe telling a story or two.
So, we've got a couple of bullet points here on things that we saw happen frequently at FREC. Salesperson failing to deliver to the broker by the next business day. Yeah. That's just what you got to remember. If you receive that check today, November the 5th, it has got to be in your broker's hands by the end of the next business day. It's got to be in your broker's hands by the end of tomorrow.
Yep.
The other one that I love, and we get this all the time, is agents saying, well, the contract wasn't effective yet. Well, if you checked that little box on the contract that says you received the $5,000 escrow at the time that you submitted the contract, it doesn't matter if it's effective or not. That money does have to be with your broker in the next business day.
And P.S., don't leave that portion blank as to who the escrow agent is.
Yeah, and to his point, on the Florida Realtors contract, FAR contract as we still call it, it has blanks in there as to who is holding the escrow. Same thing, if it's an attorney, if you're turning the escrow deposit into an attorney, it's got to be with them ASAP. And you've got to put down the name of the attorney. And not only that, Chapter 475 says, and all contact information. And that's why you see on the contract the address, the telephone number, and email. So that's got to be filled in. You cannot, and again, do I think somebody's going to come in front of FREC just because they did this? No, but if these are all things that if somebody filed a complaint against you and they saw some of these multiple violations of 475, you're going to have a hard time. And so a lot of agents will put, oh, we don't know who's going to hold the escrow yet. So they put TBD in the lines. That's a violation. The law says you have to name who the escrow agent is going to be at the time of the contract. You can always go in and change it.
Yep, pick somebody, and then if you change horses, just fix it later.
And then, of course, the broker has to deposit it within 3 business days. Here's another thing. Don't take a check that's undated. And agents think, oh, I can get around that 24-hour thing because I just won't have the buyer put a date on the check. And where I see this a lot is buyer comes in from out of town in a hurry, goes to contract and says, here's my check, but don't cash it until I get back up north and have the funds in there. So this agent is holding on to this undated check. If something goes crazy and it can be proven that you were given that check on November the 5th, you've got to have it to your broker November 6th.
Yep.
And the broker depositing, these again are office manager broker issues. You cannot deposit your escrows into operating accounts. It has to be a separate account. Broker has to reconcile every month. And you don't have to, with regard to the reconciliation, brokers will say, well, I remember seeing that, but nobody ever asked for it. Well, we're not going to ask for it unless you come in front of FREC, and you better have had the reconciliation then.
We saw so many cases month in and month out of brokerages that had issues like this, and some of them there were absolutely real circumstances why it didn't occur, because of the sudden death of the office manager. In other cases, it was just a history of failing to pay attention, follow up. There'd be gaps in the account versus what was supposed to be there, and overdrafts, and all avoidable if you just paid attention and you followed the rules, because they're pretty plain and pretty explicit.
And then remember that if you have a buyer and you have deposited the money with a title company or with an attorney, there is a requirement for you to provide proof of those funds to the seller. So remember that, another critical one. Okay.
Quick, go off script for just a minute. Back to the escrow disbursement orders. There's not much in life that's free, but EDOs are free, provided that the escrow funds that are disputed are sitting in a brokerage's account. And so once you get through the first 10 days and the parties can't work it out, no reason not to take advantage of that, rather than going to a mediation where the parties are going to split the fees and the costs, which can be couple $1,000 or more per party. And if you don't settle there, then you end up in court. So at least with the EDO, you have the opportunity to file for the disbursement order. FREC renders its opinion. If you don't like it, you can always appeal it in court too. But at least they're doing the homework, and there's a first pass that's for free. And you know what? We could go off on a whole another session on escrow disputes, and because they are interesting, and there's a lot of pitfalls to it. The one that I want to remind you of too is, as a licensee, if the contract, let's say, falls apart and it's a clear thing that maybe there was an inspection issue and it should be dispersed back to the buyer, but the seller, for whatever reason, will not sign off on that release. And that's a whole nother issue about make sure you get those releases signed. But you have a period of time, 10 days, that you have to report that to FREC. Mm-hmm. So if you've heard one party say, I'm not going to release it, and the buyer's saying, but I want it back, you need to let your broker know, and the broker needs to file with FREC that there is a dispute. So again, another legal issue. All right, here's some minor infractions that just, I always, when we go over these, I always get raised eyebrows, and I usually get people contacting me after a presentation like this and going, oh my God, I didn't know that. How much trouble am I in? So again, these aren't necessarily things that you're going to be called up on in front of FREC because you did them, but if in a case it's found that these things were violated, then it's just another charge that goes against you. Listing agreement. Hope you all know that a copy of the executed agreement must be delivered to the seller within 24 hours. Yep. And if you recall, on the listing agreement that's used frequently here in our marketplace, and it's a Florida Realtors form, under the signature lines, there is a space that says listing agreement was delivered to seller on such and such date by either email, personal delivery, whatever. That's there for a reason. So according to how your broker instructs you, if you have the right, which it's fine for an associate to sign off if that's your broker's policy. So you could sign that agreement when you're sitting right there with the seller, make another copy, take another copy with you, and hand him that agreement, and then you've satisfied that. But, and you know what, you guys, this is for your protection too, because I remember a scenario that I had in my own brokerage office where a
seller signed a listing agreement, but the agent did not deliver the executed listing agreement to him timely. Again, kind of a scenario where a neighbor or a friend said, oh, I didn't know you were selling your house. I wish I would have known. I have somebody that might be interested. And he said, well, I don't think it's in MLS yet. No worries. And so the seller goes under contract with this entity. And so the real estate agent gets with his broker and they start shouting from the rooftops and everybody's lawyering up. And then a very savvy attorney for the seller said, well, when did you get the executed listing agreement back to the seller? And the agent goes, well, I haven't yet.
Mhm.
And so guess what? You didn't have an alibi to stand on.
I always look at that as the moment a controversy over a listing agreement comes in, that's the first place I look after I check the bank. I'll sure all the signatures are there. Did they get it back to them?
Yeah. And then another one, we don't see this much anymore, but we used to. So you have an expiration date of November the 30th. And let's say that the agent wrote in a clause on the listing agreement that said something to the effect of renewal of listing agreement will be another 30 days unless the seller tells us not to renew. So it was an automatic renewal clause to the listing agreement. That specifically is in Chapter 475 as a violation.
Yep.
You cannot have automatic renewal dates.
Correct.
And then another one that I love is a TBD listing price. And believe it or not, that is a violation of a code of 475, of a statute. You've got to put up the listing agreement. Tom, I don't know if I remember all of this, but it's got to have a beginning date, an expiration date. It's got to have the listing price and signatures and something else. I don't know. But the one thing is there, it can't be a TBD for the listing price. Put a price in there. And if you're showing it to peers in your office and they decide it should be higher or lower and you want to adjust it, then you adjust it.
Yep.
But you shouldn't be leaving that price as a TBD to be determined. Yep. Okay, and here's just a silly little one. As we talked about the criminal charges, you're also, remember, you need to report things to FREC. If you change your name,
Yep.
If you get married, if you change your address, and that's a big one. And why is that so big? Because if somebody contacted FREC with a complaint against you and they try to contact you and they don't have good contact information, that's another charge. Yep. So your address, your name change, if you decide to form a PA or whatever like that, that's all got to be reported into FREC. Okay, so now that we've told you all the bad things we do from FREC as far as discipline and all that sort of thing, I think it's important to let you know some of the initiatives that during my tenure and Tom's tenure, we were able to do. FREC is not just a disciplinary agency. FREC is, think of it as the sounding board to DBPR as to what the local or what the state market is saying that DBPR needs to look at statutes and rules and maybe revise. During our FREC meetings, we were constantly having rule revisions where we would go into Chapter 475, and because we felt like some things were no longer pertinent, we would have changes. So there's a lot of things that we did during the time I was on there, and Tom. One of the things, I was served on a committee that I should not have served on. I am not one of those. I am not one of those, like wordsmithing kind of person. I look at the big thing. I leave the wordsmithing to somebody else. But we found out from a lot of the real estate schools that we had not updated the salesman syllabus, meaning the syllabus to use for the schools to use in testing. We had not updated it in something like 15 years. And you can imagine there have been many rule changes and whatever. So we spent 3 months literally going over Chapter 475 and wordsmithing and changing rules and statutes that needed to be revised. So that was a lot of work. Here was something that I didn't realize until it started happening during commission meetings. There was a period of time when I first got on that if a complaint had been filed against a sales associate, FREC was not notifying the broker. You know, think about that. That'd be like, you know, your son or daughter going out and committing something pretty serious and nobody told you about it.
Well, and you have an obligation under 475 as a broker to supervise and manage those that work for you. And oftentimes we would say, you know, you're not only the broker of record, you're the broker of liability.
Exactly.
And so that only made good sense to make sure that the broker was aware, because oftentimes they would end up being implicated in whatever bad behavior had occurred, which they may or may not have known about.
Exactly.
In the first place.
And you know, oftentimes, I mean, we had one case I'll never forget where the associate had literally lost their license. The license had been revoked by FREC, and the broker didn't know about it because at that time FREC was not notifying them. You can imagine that doesn't happen anymore. Reinstating brokers' audits. This was another thing that I was pretty hot about. So I remember in my early years in the business, well, even I was managing an office here in Sarasota in the mid-90s. And one day there was a knock on my door, and my office door, and a charming man flashing this identification from DBPR saying, I'm here to audit your office.
Yeah.
And that meant that he could audit all of our financial books. He could audit all of our files.
Mm-hmm.
So all the required documentation, like when you know, when we say you have to have a lead-based paint disclosure in there, you got to have it.
Yeah.
And they could randomly pull files. And if you didn't have required documentation, the broker was going up in front of FREC.
Mm-hmm.
So those were frequent audits. Well, then there were cutbacks with DBPR, and there were cutbacks in the number of auditors in the field or investigators in the field. So they stopped audits. Well, then by the time I got on FREC, we were having unbelievable number of cases with escrow disputes and everything, because the brokers were going, nobody ever checks on me.
Yeah, word was on the street.
Exactly. So we started back then doing spot audits. You didn't have to be notified, and they could do, just like I said, knock on your door. I was checking on the stats, and unfortunately, because of COVID, last year, with regard to audits, there was something like over 1,000 audits that were done in the state of brokers' offices.
Mm-hmm.
The first 3 months of this year, we did something like 200, but there has not been an audit because of COVID since then. So I'm a little frightened that maybe there might be some return to the Wild West. So I just caution you, brokers and office managers and agents, when your broker asks you for a required form, it's the law. You have to have it. They're not just being petty.
Well, and one of the challenges that the division faced, like you said, and this was prior to me joining the board, there had been cutbacks, and so they were in a process of rebuilding the investigative staff, and had some success, but those are not the highest paid positions, and there's a fair amount of turnover as well, and so you would have members of the public and licensees come to you and say, well, why aren't they doing more to get rid of these bad apples? And you'd say, well, you know, we're limited in some respects by the manpower that we have. On the one hand, on the other hand, you're limited if you're not tipped off, because it's not like they're sitting there in some room in Orlando or wherever with the hotline to every office knowing where the bad behavior is happening.
That's exactly right.
So.
And then another initiative is we went paperless as far as the issuance of license. And this was a big thing. Unfortunately, in our world, in real estate, we have some people that still aren't with technology, and they wanted their license mailed to them. But I remember something like what it cost the state to mail out licenses was thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yep.
And so we said, that's ridiculous. We can go to paperless. So now when you get your renewal, you know, you will get an email saying that your license has been processed, and it says, click here to print your license. Don't just delete that.
Mhm.
Because as you know, there are certain scenarios where you need to show a paper license. So make sure you're sensitive to, after your renewal, you should be getting an email link from DBPR saying, here's where you print your license. Escrow disputes, and again, this was kind of but it was a big deal. For a long time there, when we had an escrow dispute, FREC was not reaching out to buyer and seller and say, give me your take on what happened. They were just rendering a decision based on the paperwork that was turned in. And we decided that, come on, for one thing, the broker that's holding the escrow is turning in the paperwork.
Right.
And so if he's jaded as to who he thinks should receive the escrow, FREC was only getting one side of it. So we said, no, you've got to stop that. So now if there is an escrow dispute, FREC notifies you, and I think it's by email, as to getting both the sellers and buyers side of the story.
Yeah, and toward that end, we revised that. We made some little kind of tweaky changes to the EDO filing forms, specifically adding in certain fields for certain tolling dates,
Correct.
contingency dates, et cetera, which in one sense was a little self-serving for the commission and for the legal staff that was doing the analysis of the cases, so that it was clearly laid out. This is the effective date. This is the contingency date, bing, 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 because a lot of the issues would arise or were surrounding those deadlines, but it also forced those that were filing the request for the EDO to actually pay attention to the details.
Correct.
Rather than kind of the old story of, oh, I'm getting my taxes are getting audited, so here's my shoebox full of receipts.
Yeah.
People would do that with the correspondence, the contracts, you name it. It was just, here you go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we tried to bring a little more consistency to that process too.
And then Tom, I know you were really involved in the new rule changes for team advertising. Do you want to give us a tip on that?
You would have thought we were killing people with that. It was amazing. I think the train had already left the station when I joined the commission, and the purpose of that really was just to ensure that the public is informed as to who's the responsible party or brokerage behind these teams, because there were instances all over the state where teams were advertising themselves, and in some cases in a very sophisticated manner, but it appeared as though the teams were the last stop, right? So it was the Tom and Darla team, and if we worked for Sunshine Realty, it may not even have been on the sign.
Right.
And the point of that is to inform the public who is responsible for these people. Right. So it was really just to bring some consistency to how that advertising occurred. And unfortunately, because the horse was already out of the barn, there were folks who felt like, I've already done my branding and I really don't want to change it. I'm going to incur some cost. And so of course there was a lay-in period for that. And unfortunately, those people did suffer some burdens in that regard. Overall, I think most people took to it. And I think we've seen the results have been pretty positive.
And let me just kind of stress it, because I have seen, even in our local marketplace, driving around, I still see signs that don't have clear knowledge printed on the sign as to who that team, Tom and Darla show, is working for.
Right.
So be very careful with that. Okay.
Yeah, and people are starting to, and licensees were starting to pay attention to that, and in recognition of the fact that there was a lay-in period for that. I think from a process standpoint, we had anticipated that there would be reports, complaints, et cetera, and we built mechanisms to deal with that in the initial term. But at some point, the rule's the rule. You got to comply with the rule, and folks are going to report you if you're not.
So we hope that this has given you kind of a little more deep dive into what FREC does. I want to just, and this is pretty self-serving, but I always used to say it's all about me anyway. So,
You did.
but just so you know, like I would get asked, well, how much do you get paid to be a FREC commissioner? We got $50 a month, and that was what was agreed to be paid by the government of Florida back in the late 50s, and we have not received a raised in that since then. And to just kind of address real quickly again what Tom said to you earlier, we would get a link and we would hear sometimes between the 2-day periods, we would hear 300, 400 cases. And imagine that with every case, you could have anywhere from 50 to, I've seen cases with 500 pages that we had to read ahead of time. Now, I didn't give Tom full disclosure on how many hours it took to accomplish that, and I apologize for that, Tom. But at the same hand, you know, it was probably one of the best experiences of my career to just see how it works and what we do to protect not only the consumer but the licensee as well.
Well, and between the legal cases, the statutory and the rules oversight, approval of education courses, reviewing applications, folks with fact sheets. I mean, you name it. It was very formulaic each month, but you cover a lot of ground, and there is so much that the commission is responsible for that you don't really get it until you go see it, and so. Which leads us to, you can visit a FREC meeting. It gives you 3 classroom hours of CE by attending a legal agenda session. Now, prior to COVID, we used to tell you all, and I know RAISM for many years took a busload of people up from their leadership academy, I think. They did.
And it was always, you could tell these people loved it. I mean, it was so enlightening. So of course, COVID, this, as Tom alluded to earlier, the FREC meetings are now done by Zoom. However, if you go on to myfloridalicense.com and you search FREC meetings, there is a link to how you can register for the Zoom meeting. And you can sign up for it and you will have live feed to the FREC meetings. I can't tell you how much I think these are valuable. In fact, if I had my own brokerage today, I think one of the things I would do is every new licensee, I would require them at some point in time to listen to a FREC meeting.
Well, and keep in mind that it's always available, as you're mentioning. It's always available online, even if you're not taking the CE. And in some respects, some of it you can feel like there's a bit of a disconnect because, of course, you're not privy to the information the commissioners are, and that they've processed to get to the point of the questions that they're asking,
right,
and the analysis that's occurring. And so sometimes folks will come away and they say, "Well, I couldn't get from A to B to see where you were," and so you would remind them that there is so much information sitting in front of those individual commissioners, and that as they're going through whatever the issue is, whether it's a legal case or education issue, whatever, but that doesn't diminish that it is interesting and informative, and it shows you this side of the industry that otherwise you would have no idea exists. And it goes to the heart of your practice. And so why wouldn't you take a little time to see what it's like?
Absolutely. So I don't know if we have any questions in the chat room. Tom, do you have any that you saw?
Nothing except a big thank you from Mike Bruno. Thank you, Mike Bruno, as always. No, I think that's it. And I think we're bumping up almost to 2:15. We're a little short.
Yeah. And so Tom, as you know, is an attorney with Williams Parker, and we would, I can't give legal advice. Tom can. But if you've got any questions, you can reach me via email, darla@darlafirst.com. Just a simple email there. And of course, you can reach Tom here at Williams Parker. I'm sitting in his lovely conference room as we speak. But we hope you've enjoyed it. And any questions, or if you'd like for us to do presentations like this to your office meetings or whatever, we would love to do that. So take care, stay safe and well, and keep out of FREC. All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you.